Thank you so much, Dr. Pinker, for being here. So as you all probably know, so I'm Gena. I'm an academic and practicing psychologist. It's my great honor and pleasure to welcome Dr. Steven Pinker, who I'm pretty sure needs no introduction, but in case you haven't heard, he is world-renowned psychologist at Harvard University who has published many best-selling books, including the latest, Enlightenment Now and Rationality. And he is one of my living heroes. I'm sure I'm not alone in this room in saying that. And he's a great champion of many of the Enlightenment era values of reason, humanism, civil discourse that I know are at the heart of what unites this community. So since we have Dr. Pinker for just a little over an hour, after which we can continue the discussion on our own, I'm going to try to make the most of our precious time by front-loading the conversation with some direct framing questions and discussion points for you, Dr. Pinker. And then after about 20 minutes, give or take, maybe it'll bleed into 30, but no more than halfway through the hour, I'm going to open it up for questions and for discussion, and we'll invite comments from the larger group. Meanwhile, you're welcome to avail yourselves of the chat, as Anna mentioned, if you want to log your questions for later discussion. Maybe you'll intrigue us enough that we just won't be able to help it. We'll jump in to answer. Or if you just want to engage in some real-time conversation as we go. So with that said, I'm going to proceed. So I'm going to set a little bit of context, partially in reference to your most recent book, Rationality, Dr. Pinker, which is much of the immediate inspiration for the topic as I've conceived it for today. And sort of what I think is a shared passion between us, and I imagine everybody here, which is that we love rationality. And I think we share a conviction that following reason is good, in fact, essential to human thriving. And that's true both for us as individuals and as a civilization. And yet we also know and observe that many people don't seem to share our conviction, and that whether they expressly avow it, some disavow it explicitly, but even if not, they don't consistently act on it. Probably we haven't consistently acted on it. Probably every one of us in this room has at least sometimes not been an exemplar of reason and rationality, even despite our own kind of spoken commitments. And so one thing that that you demonstrate really nicely, Dr. Pinker, in your book Rationality, is that people are often more rational than we give them credit for, right? So I think that's one explanation that we can understand, that often if we really look in the context of, well, what problems are people trying to solve in the real world and what tools of rationality are helpful to those problems, then we can understand, okay, maybe people aren't quite as deluded as our social psychology research sometimes leads us to believe. But as you also acknowledge in the book, sometimes people are just outright irrational, right? And as you also really beautifully note, one of your aspirations in the book is to inspire people to set their sights higher than the self-defeating or collectively destructive goals that they sometimes irrationally pursue, right? And to choose the pursuit of truth over, for example, the desire to win an argument or to kind of best our opponent or to feel as if we're the smartest or the wisest in the room. So today, what I really want to do is kind of dig into the challenge of doing that, of inspiring that kind of loftier, sort of commitment and standard in ourselves and in other people. And I think to do that, we have to think about, well, what motivates, what inspires rationality in the first place? Which leads us into a philosophical debate that you touch on in the book between, on the one hand, we've got Hume, who famously says, reason is a slave of the passions, right? So this debate around, is there such a thing as having a rational motivation or an irrational motivation? Can reason guide us on better or worse ends to pursue, or is it really just going to help us with the means to whatever ends, right? We have Hume, who says that ultimately reason is a slave of the passions, but then we have other philosophers, right? Aristotle, Plato, Kant, who held that there are such things as rational and irrational ends. In fact, apparently a philosopher friend of mine who might be on this call recently told me Plato was actually the one who coined the phrase, reason is the slave of the passions, except he meant that was a bad thing. That for some people who are bad, reason is the slave of their passions, whereas there are other people who are better for whom reason is actually in charge and sort of setting the agenda. So I'd love to hear, Dr. Pinker, where do you currently fall? Kind of what's your thinking about, is there merit, especially in that latter set of views? Is there any sense in which there are more or less rational ends that we could be pursuing and more or less rational ways that we could be choosing our ends to begin with?
Yes, I think it's my reading of Hume is not that he was advising people to go with their gut and live for the moment and have fun while you can and have sex with the first attractive stranger that you see, and if food looks good, eat as much as you want. If someone annoys you, then blow your stack. I don't think that was what he meant when he said reason is and always must be the slave of the passions. I think he was using passions in a rather technical sense to just mean goals, desires, wants. And he's just saying that you really can't even define reason as without identifying what it is that the person is using reason for. Now that can be to establish objective truth, but as you mentioned, Gena, it can also be to show how smart you are, to win an argument, to show how noble your side is, to kind of steer the conversation in a direction that's going to end up being good for you. Like, where should we have the meeting? Well, here are 17 rational reasons why it should be near me, so I don't have to schlep on the subway and everyone else has to. We have countless temptations like that. So I think what Hume was saying is he's making the logical point that you can't even talk about what reason is until you say what is it is being deployed in service of. Because just saying true things is not rationality, it's not reason, because you can crank out logical implications of a statement till the cows come home, and you'd be saying nothing but true things, like Albany is the capital of New York, or pigs can fly. Albany is the capital of New York, or the moon is made of cheese. Now, logic will tell you that in any disjunction, A or B, the statement is true if either the A is true or the B is true. So you can crank out completely useless, meaningless statements using logic, and no one would give you credit for being particularly rational. That's how you spend your time. It's got to be, and if we were to look for a common denominator of rationality, I think it would be the use of knowledge to attain a goal. We distinguish between a rational entity, that is, would you be willing to credit that animal, that robot, that person with rationality? Well, you would if they tried out multiple means of getting what they want. If you put a rock in their path, they walk around the rock, or they climb over the rock, or they use a crowbar and they remove the rock. They attain the goal by multiple means. That's what I would define rationality as, and I think that's really what Hume meant. So if you, once you realize that, once you set a goal, there's no question of whether you should be rational or not. I mean, do you want the goal or not? If you do, rationality is what allows you to get it. However, there are often cases in which we set a goal that we can't particularly defend, or that we is different from one that we could collectively agree on. I think we all collectively agree that that the truth is good, and that Sam's pet theory of how the world works, we have no stake in it. That shouldn't be something that we collectively pursue unless Sam happens to be right, in which case he has to show it. So there's the goal of an objective communal truth or correct means to attain a goal. If the goal is to reduce carbon emissions, to reduce racism, to reduce poverty, to reduce disease, what's actually going to get us there? And it's very hard to disagree that whatever will work is what we ought to strive for. Now, what makes it hard is partly the self-serving biases that often mean that the goal that a particular person sets is not the goal that everyone else would agree to, such as being right, being seen as a genius, being seen as a saint. Sometimes our cognitive faculties, our faculties of reason, were not evolutionarily adapted to the world that we live in, a world with data and with experimental science and with record keeping and with journalism. We evolved and spent most of our history until pretty recently in face-to-face networks where our source of information was our own experience or gossip and rumor. That was the best we could do. And the idea that you should go look something up, see what the national statistics are of, say, how many terrorism deaths, how many plane crash deaths, how many deaths from police shootings, how many deaths from shark attacks, as opposed to how many deaths from air pollution, how many deaths from falls off ladders, how many deaths from drownings. That's something that doesn't come naturally to people. The natural thing is to go with vivid anecdotes. Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman called it the availability bias, namely you use available episodes in memory as your way of judging probability and risk instead of going to the best data available. One of a number of biases that they and others have documented that have gave rise to a kind of consensus that I was not willing to start with when I wrote Rationality, which is, I think you could overinterpret the work of Tversky and Kahneman and other cognitive psychologists as saying, well, we're just a bunch of biases and fallacies and irrationalities and dirty and quick rules of thumb. That itself doesn't do us justice, because after all, we're the species that came up with the rules of rationality, the benchmarks against which we can compare everyday reason and say we fall short. It wasn't a bunch of space aliens that gave us logic and probability and science. We were rational enough to do it. And when it comes to people's everyday lives, to getting the kids clothed and fed and off to school on time and keeping food in the fridge and gas in the car, most people are rational enough to do that. And in that way, they exceed our current artificial intelligence and robots. We don't have a robot that you would entrust your kids to right now because they don't have common sense. And we do. Common sense involves an awful lot of rationality. So the puzzle that I began with is, given that it is undeniable that people fall for many cognitive traps, how is it at the same time our species managed to come up with these stupendous achievements of rationality? And part of the answer is that we don't do it individually. We pool our wisdom, our rationality in institutions like science, like journalism, like democracy, like universities, where people can ideally point out the flaws in each other's reasoning. So even if any one person is riddled with fallacies and biases, there'll be someone else to point them out, ideally. And when we do discover more formal, more generally applicable rules of reasoning, ones that can lift us out of our day-to-day experience and that we can apply to the past, that we can apply to the microscopic, that we can apply to the cosmic, then we can pool that knowledge in written forms, in electronic data sets. We can share them with language, now with electronic communications media, and we can be more rational collectively than any of us can hope to be individually. And that's a major discovery that kind of sank in over the course of writing Rationality, which is to resolve the paradox of how, as a species, we're so rational, and individually, so many of us make so many fallacies. You have to look to institutions that coordinate our rationality.
Yeah, that is incredibly helpful, and I think just really, it takes us a long way toward demystifying, right, some of that puzzle of both, on the one hand, how is it that we have achieved such tremendous heights of rationality, and on the other hand, how is it that we so often don't, depending on which of those seems puzzling, right, from a given paradigm. And so just to then push it, I think, even a step further, a couple of questions. So one question is, on the point that we pool our efforts and that we kind of use the common agreed upon goals of the society, of the civilization, which I think, I think our scientific establishment on the one hand is a great example of it. And on the other hand, well, we're having a crisis of credibility and, a replication crisis within our particular, scientific community. But B, it seems like not all communities equally share some of the goals that we're now on about, right? There have been whole cultures and, and certainly subcultures, communities within communities that, however, explicitly disavow the goals of either science or humanism or, equality, and kind of pit other ends above the ones that we would like to believe are going to advance our interests. And then part of the reason I ask is because where this comes up for me most often, so I'm a practicing psychologist, I'm a clinician, a coach, and I research how to do that better. How do we kind of help individual people kind of think through things in their lives better? And what I encounter most often is the ways that people kind of have to grapple with a lot of these things at an individual level, right? Because some of our most intimate personal choices and kind of high stakes decisions about, like, do I keep cheating on my spouse? Do I leave this safe job and take this riskier job? Do I defy my family and pursue, this less financially stable or less high status career? That what I see is that people will often go through the motions of the kinds of thinking tools and the kinds of, kind of tools of reason that you describe, but they're going through the motions, right? So sometimes they're actually really trying to figure out, like, what will be the effects on my marriage if I keep cheating on, if I continue with this affair, or like, what are the risks and benefits of quitting this job, trying something new? And other times they're going through the motions of doing that, even to themselves. But what they're really doing is they're just trying to feel vindicated about the affair so that they can continue it and not actually have to think about the consequence. Or they're trying to get me to reassure them that this current job is fine so that they don't have to deal with the question or sort of the responsibility of making a risky decision. And what I really wonder is, what do you make of those two modes? Like, how do we understand them? Ultimately, how do we help people toward what I think we agree is the better mode?
Yeah, it is obviously a profound question. And I in the book, I have in the chapter on rationality and irrationality, I address the feeling that all of us get about each other and about ourselves in our more lucid moments, that often what we do is irrational. And the question is, why don't we stop? Why don't you just be more rational? And part of the answer is that often it does depend on the goals that you choose. And often when we say someone is being irrational, they're often choosing a goal that gives them a certain amount of pleasure in the short term at the expense of a greater amount of pleasure over the long term. It's for many people, it's captured concretely in the marshmallow test. You're a 4-year-old and the experimenter says you can have 1 marshmallow now, or if you wait for 15 minutes, you can get 2 marshmallows. What does the child do? Sometimes call it self-control, delay of gratification, discounting the future. And that is a human dilemma. And it is a dilemma, I think it pops up in some of the examples that you've mentioned. And there's no correct answer, in the sense that the future may never come. As the bumper sticker says, life is short, eat dessert first. We are never sure that what the future will bring. There's always uncertainty. Maybe the experimenter won't give you the 2 marshmallows in 15 minutes, whereas a marshmallow in the hand is worth 2 in the bush, 2 in the 15-minute hence bush. But often, I think if we were to sit down and think it through, we would realize that we discount the future too steeply, in the sense that we overvalue gratification for our present self at the expense of our future self. Now, some of the ways of dealing with that, and I'm sure you have many, because you must deal with this in your coaching, in your psychotherapy, is people can, they can exert raw willpower. They could just call on their rational self to realize, oh, well, it'll feel good now, it'll taste good now, but then they'll be hell to pay tomorrow, in a week, in a month. Then there's also the technique that Homer discovered in the Odyssey, which Odysseus had the sailors tie him to the mast so that he could not be seduced by the alluring song of the sirens and steer the ship onto the rocks. That is, proactively foreclose options for the present self in order to benefit a future self. Just don't put yourself in a situation in which temptation arises or you can act on it. And part of what we often call rationality is figuring out ways of not succumbing to a small imminent reward at the expense of a larger later reward. So that's part of it. Another part is that often one person's goals conflict with another person's goals, and so you could be pursuing your goals, but you could be a jerk and be screwing everyone around you, and they might have other ideas as to what your goals should be. And of course, it does tie into pleasure now as opposed to pleasure later, because you can poison your professional and personal relationships if you prioritize your goals over the expense of theirs. So those are at least some ways to think about what's going on when we feel that we or others are being irrational in day-to-day choices.
Yeah, I mean, part of what I'm hearing you get at is that there are strategies and there's knowledge. I'm always thinking as an interventionist. So my end game is always, how do I help people do this better? And how do I inspire them and sort of, pull them up to kind of achieve their full potential? And part of what I think you're getting at is that, like with the marshmallow test, a lot of what I really loved about the actual, like Walter Mischel's book, really kind of taking us through the whole research literature, is that it turns out a lot of this stuff is learnable, right? Like you can actually teach a child strategies for helping them to kind of abstract away from the marshmallow in front of them by thinking about it as clouds in the sky, or by distracting themselves with songs, right? And you can, and interestingly, on the flip side, when you mentioned, the future is uncertain, there's really cool research on the kind of moderating effects of things like SES, things like attachment history on people's willingness to delay gratification, where for kids from low SES environments, for example, they're less likely to wait, but that's somewhat, I think, mediated by, I don't trust that this grown-up is going to fulfill their promise. I don't trust that I'm going to get the $10, in a week if I don't kind of cut my losses now. So I think that that's really profound.
Yes, and it's far from being irrational. That is what rational discounting the future consists of. So when you invest in a totally safe venture like government bonds, you settle for a small rate of interest that is not so many marshmallows 30 years down the line, because you're so sure that the government will repay you. Whereas if it's a risky startup, you demand a higher rate of return, or you're lending money to someone and there's some risk that they will default, you demand a higher rate of interest, precisely because you calibrate the rate of interest, that is how many marshmallows you expect down the line, with the probability that you'll get any marshmallows at all. So the kids who come from an uncertain environment and don't wait for the second marshmallow are not being irrational, at least by definition. Now, there are, by the way, and it is true that all of us through our lives learn strategies of self-control, sometimes Odyssean ones, namely we foreclose our options. We don't shop when we're hungry. We don't buy junk food that's going to sit around the house and tempt us when the time comes. If it's not there and you have to get up off the couch and go outside, you're probably less likely to do it. That's one way in which you can resist temptation. Or cognitive means, such as the ones that you mentioned, of visualizing the tempting alternative as something that isn't so tempting, or just distracting yourself. And it is something that, even though I think there probably are some heritable differences in willingness to delay gratification, on top of whatever there certainly are methods that we can and we do and we should master through our lives.
Yeah. And with all of that, I know in 3 minutes, I'm going to turn it over. And if people want to start raising hands, I'm going to I'm going to try to keep track of the order as best I can, so we can start questions coming pretty soon.
I'll mention one other thing just to take off on a point that you made that is also very insightful in terms of our human rationality, is that you mentioned that often when patients or clients see you, it's not so much that they want advice as they want kind of a ratification or approval of what they wanted to do in the first place. And we all are, as well as being rational animals, we are rationalizing animals. That is, we can deploy our intellect to all kinds of goals. And one of the goals is to lay out kind of after the fact justifications for why what we want to do is the rational thing to do. It goes, this is a discovery, of course, any observer of human nature has could point this out, and I'm sure La Rochefoucauld had a pithy saying about it. But of course, it was the basis for the whole theory of cognitive dissonance from Leon Festinger, inspired by work he did with Stanley Schachter, when the two of them infiltrated an end of the world cult, and they kind of embedded themselves in the cult, waiting to see what would happen when the world didn't end on December 31st, 1950, or whatever the date was. And what they found was that some of the members of the cult said, oh, they're wrong, they're full of malarkey, I'm going to get back to living a life. But some of them doubled down, and they used their ingenuity to figure out why. Well, maybe they miscalculated the date, maybe it's 1950, maybe it's 1952, and they deployed all of their ingenuity to rationalize what they had predicted in the first place. And that led Festinger to his theory of cognitive dissonance. In other words, rationalization. And indeed, it is a powerful motive in humans. It's a motive basically to make us look competent and consistent and moral to everyone else, while
including ourselves.
And including ourselves. Well, perhaps starting with ourselves, because the best salesperson is the one who believes in the product. And so if each one of us believes that we're perfectly consistent and rational, it makes it easier to try to convince others.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for that. The essence of what I'd love to grapple with in our remaining time is the difference between the people who walked away and the people who doubled down. Because the fact is that some did one, some did the other. Now, which of them are being rational? Because as you said, the ones who are rationalizing, if anything, they're putting their human ingenuity, their powers of reason to work, except they're putting it to work in a way to tear down the real reasons that they might consider if they actually really wanted to know what was true, including what was best for them, actually, right? And so that's what really fascinates me, is that there's this irreducible difference in motivations, right? That when you feel the dissonance that, ooh, I thought one thing, but now this other thing, what do you do with that? Because I actually think, what I teach in therapy and coaching, what I try to practice is the way I want to resolve dissonance is by actually figuring out, wait, there's a conflict. That means something doesn't compute. So I need to really figure out what's true if I ultimately want to live my best life, versus I want to get rid of the feeling as if there's a conflict, right? And to me, those are like fundamentally different. And yet we kind of brush over them with the same sort of brushstrokes. Like, in our field, when we talk about motivated reasoning, as we know, we mean badly motivated reasoning. Like, that term means you're motivated by something other than wanting to know what's true. But how do we not have a term for like truth motivated reasoning, which we don't really? I've been looking into it, and people try to talk about it in various ways, but it's sort of not really that robustly represented in the literature. Like, something has to motivate us to do the harder thing and actually try to actually walk away from, the cult, from the death cult or whatever it is. And I'm looking for questions. Please, use the raise hand feature. But yeah,
it is a profound question. And I think because as you say, if you're already in the cult, you've already sacrificed things in your personal life, not least your own reputation for sanity. And then there are conflicting goals in deciding what to do when reality intrudes. One goal being to live in conformity with reality, such as that the world was not going to end in the 1950s, and anything that you do in anticipation of the false belief is going to harm you, in the sense that reality is unforgiving, reality is what is. On the other hand, you do take a hit to your reputation for already having sunk the costs into the sacrifices that you have made, and restoring your reputation for sanity and reasonableness is itself a goal that we can't avoid. Now, in some cases, one has to avoid the sunk cost fallacy, namely making a decision on the basis of how much you've invested in the past in some outcome, as opposed to how much you can expect going forward. And doubling down would certainly be an example of the sunk cost fallacy, because even though you may not look like an idiot as you're explaining why the prediction failed, at that moment, someone could say, well, he isn't totally deluded. I can see why there is some reason to think the world still will end. Wait a bit longer and that person will be embarrassed again, and they'll be in even worse shape. So, in general, the sunk cost fallacy really is a fallacy, and it's one that we should we're better off if we are aware of. Now, in terms of but your question of how do we attain not so motivated reasoning, objective reasoning, disinterested reasoning, fearless pursuit of the truth.
Or is it disinterested? Or how do we get really interested in genuine reality-oriented reasoning? Perhaps I can put it that way.
Disinterested in the sense of unbiased, without a vested interest in. And I think that brings us back to our discussion of institutions, namely, simply because it's always so tempting to each one of us pursuing our lives to do what's good for us and what's good for us now, as opposed to what's good for everyone or what's good for us for the rest of our lives. So how do we do it? One is that since one part of us always has to concede, the truth is the truth. Reality is what doesn't go away when you stop believing in it. I'm not just trying to hoodwink you with my personal propaganda. What I'm arguing for really, really, really is the truth. At the end of the day, everyone some part of them has got to concede, the truth is really what we ought to strive for. But we can't so easily implement that in our moment-to-moment arguing, where we always fall back on what's good for us, what makes us look good. And part of the answer is, if we sign on to these norms and institutions that have as one of their goals objectivity, disinterestedness, pursuit of the truth, pursuit of the greater good, and the rules of those institutions are set up to maximize that, then it's going to really suck when someone gets to show you that you're wrong, but you kind of signed on to that when you had the right to show why they were wrong. And that's why in science we have peer review and demand for empirical testing. The idea is that you want your theory to be right, and so what? So everyone wants their theory to be right. I want my theory to be right. You got to admit, not everyone can be right about everything. So how's this? Why don't we all join this society? We're going to call it science, where you get to point out what's wrong with other people's ideas, but they get to point out what's wrong with your ideas. Do you agree to play that game? Do you agree to join that club? It's hard to say no if you, for one thing, if you do say no, you'd be conceding that your own ideas can't stand on their merits. And once you do agree to it, once you join the club, well, then you're fair game. Then other people can criticize you. They can reject your papers. They can demand that you replicate your experiments or prove them if you've never shown them in the first place. And likewise in the court system and in a liberal democracy and in a responsible journalistic outlet. You sign on abstractly to the pursuit of truth. You follow rules that are designed to pursue the truth, and therefore your own subjective, egocentric motives don't matter as much in the scheme of things. Even something like Wikipedia, there are the 5 pillars of Wikipedia, and one of them is objectivity, and another one is sourcing. And as soon as you enter the Wikipedia universe, you've kind of signed on to those ideals. And the arguments that they have in the Wikipedia back pages are over how good a claim to objectivity does this bit of an article have. So that's kind of abstractly, that's our way out. That I think is my best answer to your question. Given that we are mortal humans, how could we ever rise to this wonderful but seemingly unattainable standard of disinterested objective truth?
Yeah, so much I would love to say to even further build on that, but I want to give an opportunity to our questioners. So when you ask your question, if you could please at least just quickly introduce yourself, just tell us a few words about who you are, where you're coming from. So, and I believe David, you were first with your hand. So, hello.
Hi there. Very nice to meet all of you. So I'm have a small software company and live in Western Massachusetts, and I'm very interested in the sort of the concepts of progress studies and how society survives over the long term and also thrives over the long term. My question is really the topic of institutions and how they help to maintain rationality. And we have some, you gave some wonderful examples, the institution of science and Wikipedia. But it seems if you look at some of the institutions that really govern so much of our lives, like a liberal democracy, the government and the people, the democracy itself, there are many, many examples, it seems to me, of irrationality. And I'm wondering, how, if you have some ideas of how to improve that. I've spoken with other people about, for example, creating endpoints, adding more of the aspects of science to government, and saying ahead of time, if you're creating legislation, that this is the outcome that the legislation should create, and we give it a certain amount of time, and we measure the outcome, and if it doesn't create the outcome that we said its purpose was for, then we roll it back and try again, or adjust it, or do something else. That there's kind of a rational mechanism for some of these processes that don't really have a lot of structure to them. And I'm just wondering, what are some of the ideas for how some of these other institutions can be improved? And if you have other ideas, like examples of how liberal democracies really do maintain rationality. I don't see it as obviously as all that. I don't look at liberal democracy and say there's a lot of rational decisions. I look at it more as like it's sort of keeping the outliers in both directions of extreme rationality and extreme irrationality. You're sort of going down the middle, but you're not really promoting a high level of rationality. You're just avoiding some of the pitfalls of irrationality. So anyway, that was my question.
Thank you.
Well, certainly the criterion that you mentioned, namely, if you have a policy that's designed to attain a goal, you should measure whether it's succeeded in attaining the goal once it's implemented, and if not, get rid of it and try something else. And there is too little of that in most governments. There is a movement to do more of that, evidence-based policy. But since many of those experiments come at the expense of the city or the state or the province or the country in which they're tried, while you're doing all that experimenting, another part of the solution is to learn from the laboratories of other jurisdictions. That is, to have networks in which governments can exchange their hard-won wisdom of what works and what doesn't. Of course, you have to make adjustments for local differences and idiosyncrasies. But there's far too much of the not invented here mentality in governments that the policymakers don't look enough to what's been tried elsewhere. I'm affiliated with an organization called Apolitical, which tries to do that, they've noted that most policy reports are downloaded 0 times, and they just try to make policymakers and policy analysts and civil servants all over the world learn best practices elsewhere. So that's part of it. I think some degree of revisiting, retuning. Certainly one of the reasons that people are often, I think, more jaded about liberal democracy than at least my own rhetoric would aim for is that they look at the United States, which is not the poster child for rational government, rational liberal democracy. As a country, we do okay among the world's 193 countries, but we're not number 1 in anything, pretty much. And in terms of measures of what counts, lifespan and education and child mortality and maternal mortality and obesity and drug abuse and educational achievement, we're in the 20s, happiness, suicide. So, it's really better to have been born in the United States than to be born in Senegal or Afghanistan. But we're better still to be born in Canada, or where I'm speaking from at this moment, or Iceland, or Norway, or New Zealand. And probably we have something to learn from the governance in those jurisdictions. Not everywhere all the time, because as any Canadian will tell you, there's a lot of screw-ups here. But but given that no one is smart enough to know a priori what institutions are going to work, we should be humble and, like scientists, go with the data as best we can. And that includes not just particular policies like how do you reduce traffic on a crowded freeway, how do you reduce accidental deaths at train crossings, but the mechanisms of democracy themselves, which ought to be examined rationally and empirically, what actually leads to the right outcome, theoretically and in practice. Or again, I mean, it just doesn't take long to show practices that are baked into American governance that are just totally irrational, that no one could justify them. First past the post voting, namely the plurality wins in a three-way race. Just no one can defend that. And there is no voting system that's perfect, that satisfies all criteria that you would want, but some satisfy more than others. And the one that we have in the United States is among the worst. And there are other features of it, such as closed primaries, such as one party, one representative, one district representation that we have reason to believe could be and should be approved. And part of the impediment is no surprise, namely that more and more, especially in the United States, but also elsewhere, politics is seen more as combat against an evil enemy as opposed to solving really, really wicked problems. And that polarization, including mutual demonization, means that anything that one side proposes, even if it by a miracle happened to be rational, would be instantly rejected by the other side, at least all too often.
Yeah. I'm going to sneak in one quick kind of follow-up thought before going to Greg, who's our next hand raise, which is that following up on the observation, Dr. Pinker, that at least some of the groups, the governments, the institutions we observe don't exactly inspire confidence that, yes, this is now bringing out our better natures, right? And again, from my vantage point as a clinician who really thinks about, my kind of locus of influence often is the individual or the individuals that I'm addressing. And I think of much of what I'm aiming at with individuals as being a kind of like internal version of the institution, in the sense that I'm trying to build a certain kind of character in that, right? I'm trying to help them to kind of condition their own internal environment into one that actually values and recognizes what you had said earlier, that, look, reality is what it is. And my temporarily making myself feel as if this isn't, as if I haven't already paid this price, or as if I didn't have to make this trade-off, doesn't actually make it true. And therefore kind of helping people to more and more often be motivated to choose, like, I want to actually be okay. I don't want to just temporarily pretend to be okay. I feel as if I'm okay. So they wanted to throw that in there. It's just a cool connection.
No, that does sound quite significant. And I'm imagining, again, not myself being neither a clinician nor a coach or a therapist, but I would think that just the basic wisdom of taking the outside view of yourself as opposed to always the inside view. What would I advise someone else who's in my situation to do? What do other people think of me doing this versus that? It's not a panacea, because there's no such thing as a panacea, but it probably can provide insight, at least on some occasions.
Indeed, and often does. An oft-used strategy. Okay, Greg, introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Greg Salmieri. I'm a philosopher. I teach at the University of Texas and work in a think tank as part of the university. I guess this is connected to the issue I think you guys were both agreeing on, the question of, like, what does it take to strive for more objectivity? In what ways communities be useful for that? One thing that I noticed is when Dr. Pinker, you were talking about the common goal shared by the healthy communities of inquirers, and Gena, when you were talking about the strategies we might try to implement in ourselves, the goals of kind of rational thinking or the kind of rational thinking we want to be doing tend to be formulated, the ends tend to be formulated fairly abstractly. So there's both the long and short term marshmallow now versus marshmallow later, but there's also, like, is the kind of thing I'm seeking a marshmallow or a rush of pleasure, which is something, specific, or is it truth, reality, goodness, a healthy community? These are things that are formulated more abstractly. And my sense is that to even have an abstract goal is something that's specific to reason. Part of reason, what reason does is formulates things abstractly. And that's part of what is sometimes meant by the tradition that doesn't think of reason as only means end reasoning to satisfy a passion, but even to have a desire or a passion that's not for something here and now or at a specific time. You need to be thinking of it in general terms. So I wonder, what do you think is the role of abstraction in rationality, and how does that relate to means end thinking?
Yeah, a profound question, and I think it enters into it in several ways. One of them is that a lot of going back to the puzzle, the apparent paradox that even drove me to write Rationality, which is how do we reconcile the fact that, at least collectively as a species, we've achieved these great feats of rationality, but individually we seem to be vulnerable to so many fallacies. And part of it is that we are much more rational in the concrete than in the abstract. That many of the standard laboratory fallacies, like ignoring base rates in interpreting a medical test, that is, if someone has a test that shows positive, we don't take into account, well, if the disease is really rare, most of the positives are false positives, or hearing a stereotype like Penelope is very creative and spontaneous and loves poetry. Is she likely to be a psychology major or a fine arts major? And people say fine arts major because that's the stereotype, not taking into account that for every fine arts major, there are 100 psychology majors, and that should enter into the calculation. A lot of these fallacies come when you are a failure to apply an abstract principle, like the one that I just mentioned. Take into account base rates in interpreting a bit of evidence. Now, even more abstract, we call it Bayes' theorem or Bayes' rule. When people are given much more concrete scenarios to interpret, if they see descriptions of people pulled out of a hat where the slips of paper reflect the percentages in the population, and they can actually see them being drawn, then they often don't fall for the fallacy. And likewise, logical puzzles that people sometimes are vulnerable to in the lab, if you state them in concrete terms of social obligations and cheating and contracts, then people act perfectly logical. So part of what we often mean by logical and rational is not just applying rationality kind of baked into concrete scenarios of our day-to-day lives, where people really often are rational, but having it as a all-purpose handy-dandy tool, a theorem that you can apply to anything, or an abstract principle. Also, another way in which rationality, I think abstraction does enter into rationality, and you mentioned ideals such as objectivity and truth, is that these are not subjective, at least not as defined, and they're therefore things that are more likely to command agreement in an entire community. I can't get everyone to agree to Steve's truth. I mean, why should you? But if I couch it as the truth, then it's something that you're more likely to get buy-in. And even a lot of our morality, when we push it, consists of abstracting away from our own idiosyncratic goals to what could apply to everyone. How would you like it if he did that to you? Do unto others. Act as if the maximum of your act can be made universal. Where it's the abstraction, namely prying it away from your own parochial idiosyncratic interests, that both makes it kind of rational, that anyone can sign on to it, and kind of conduces to what I think we'd be likely to call moral or more ethical.
Gina, I think you're muted.
I am indeed. Sorry. Yes, you caught it as I did. Jason, I'm going to go ahead and keep going through the queue. Thank you. Dr. Pinker. Super interesting. Jason, you there? Hey.
Hello, yes, hi. So my name is
Jason.
Jason Crawford, hi. And I write about the history of technology and the philosophy of progress, and have really enjoyed your books, Dr. Pinker. So I noticed when you were answering Gena's question earlier about how people can be more rational, and I noticed this in your book as well, that the examples you gave, you went first to sort of group examples or social examples of, we can join a community of scientists, for instance, who all agree to certain rational rules, and now we're sort of binding ourselves to those rules. Do you see those mechanisms as primarily social? Are there important individual sort of mechanisms that work at the individual level? That is, if I want to be more rational, is the main thing that I do join a community of people who will keep me in line, or are there kind of individual level, things that are equally important?
Yeah, no, a good question. And no, it clearly can't just be that other people are always, kind of watching you and making sure that you don't stray too far to line. It helps, but it can't be the only one, because sometimes you're acting alone in the privacy of your own home or your own mind. So certainly, adopting ideals, just reminding yourself, that long term is something that I should try to give more weight to. Other people's interests are things I ought to give more weight to. Things that I could defend if I was forced to, I should give more weight to. And probably psychologically, the rationality is probably sometimes is implemented by the internalizing the voice of one of these rational institutions in your own consciousness, to sort of have the voice of other people kind of judging you as you ponder a decision, whether it be just a moral decision, should I exploit someone, should I deceive someone, or an epistemic decision, should I accept this evidence that goes against my theory. It really sucks when I have to do that, but on the other hand, I really do have to admit that that's the way I ought to be evaluating my own beliefs. So almost imagining other people judging you is a way of kind of internalizing that community, even when you're not in the midst of it.
You're next, Anna. Just really quick afterthought on that it's interesting, again, from a clinician's vantage point, to hear you kind of analogize, to hear you kind of speak of the internalization of the other people's voices as a corrective to our own less rational voice, because in the context of therapy, coaching, I so much more often find myself trying to help people get certain irrational voices out of their heads, whether that's, you name it, right? The voice of their guilting.
That is sort of a classic, a classic task.
As you can imagine, right?
Motive therapy and cognitive therapy, right? Yes.
Yeah, but I think it's sort of notable that the voices we get into our heads from the kind of luck of the draw of who we grew up around, and what kind of messaging we got from whatever group we didn't necessarily choose and select ourselves into, right? We kind of just found ourselves in whatever, like family unit, school, you name it, right? That oftentimes a lot of the work I find in helping someone toward a more rational kind of character and habit structure is rethinking a lot of what they've internalized, right, from whoever, and then choosing, okay, well, whose voice do you want, right? And then eventually maybe that becomes your voice, and that becomes more authentic because you can actually really sign on to it in a way that is like really, based in your own judgment, kind of grounded in your own reasoning too, or that you could kind of retrace the steps of the reasoning.
No, that's really an excellent point, and it does qualify what I said. The problem, of course, with other people's voices is that they have their own interests, not necessarily so rational, that might conflict with your interests. So you're not. So it isn't enough to just follow the dictates of any old person who's trying to guilt trip you, to pressure you, to possibly to exploit you. And so one needs maybe even like a meta voice of all these voices, including my own. Which one should I take seriously? Who has a right to set standards for me, and can those standards themselves be justified?
Yeah, that's beautifully put. And I think a lot of what I strive to cultivate is that meta voice that is, kind of the internal arbiter. Anna.
Thank you so much.
So
Hi, I'm Anna Gath. I'm the founder of Interintellect. I have some very simple questions to you, Stephen. One is, what is it about our era that seems to call for writing manifestos in defense of human goodness or the possibility of human goodness and rationality?
I missed one word. So I'm sorry, Anna. Can you just repeat, what is it about our era that, and
Seems
just fill in those few words which just dropped out or
Oh,
softened me
sorry.
down here? Sorry.
Yeah. So what is about today that calls to you for writing manifestos in defense of the possibility or about the possibility of human goodness and rationality? Why you? What made you specialize to this? And how can we help? So if an individual is watching this, faced with this enormity, how can they contribute? How can they take part?
There are several things that motivated me to write the book, and it grew out of a course that I taught at Harvard, and which raised the question why that course then called Rationality. Part of it was a long-standing belief that I had and many of my colleagues that some of the tools, some of the benchmarks of rationality that we use as scientists and that we set as standards against which we compare human irrationality are things that ought to be part of every educated person's conventional wisdom, their mental toolkit. Everyone should know the concept behind Bayesian reasoning. Everyone should understand, some glimmerings of probability and logic and how to tell correlation from causation, how to make a rational choice. And there are bodies of mathematics and logic that set standards. They're sometimes called normative models or normative theories. That is how one ought to reason if one were rational. That I think have not been assembled in one place and offered as a way to make yourself more rational. And so I wanted to put those tools. I came up with the 6 that I thought were the most useful in one place, and that was one of the goals of writing Rationality, and that's the heart of the book, or those chapters. But in that, as soon as I mentioned the topic, I could not avoid the question: why does the world seem to be losing its mind? Why do we have, the fake news and the conspiracy theories and the quack cures and the paranormal woo-woo and the crystal power healing and holistic this, that, and the other thing? Not to mention, and stop the steal and QAnon and chemtrails. And so I had to deal with that, the more florid aspects of human irrationality, especially collective public irrationality that has captured so much attention. How do we deal with it? How do we make it more prominent? Well, I like to think that even making it a thing, like, are we really being rational? Because very few people can argue for irrationality. Because you can always say, well, geez, is that argument rational? And if not, well, you say, well, I don't have to believe it. Neither does anyone else. And you probably don't. That's probably not what you want us to think. You probably do want to think it's rational. So we're all kind of committed to rationality, and we can kind of hold our collective feet to the fire and say, well, given that really at the end of the day, no one claims to be irrational. So if we want to be rational, what does that actually consist of? And let's do more of it. And part of that is kind of being aware of these normative tools. And part of it also is reflecting a bit more, being a little more self-conscious, being a little more humble in terms of our own knowledge, our own wisdom, our own rectitude, and our meaning not just me as a guy, but my tribe, my political party, my faction, my posse, my coalition, which is the source of a lot of irrationality. Just to make people think, well, yeah, I'm probably going to say what all of my buddies and the people whose respect I crave say, but is that always going to be true? Well, probably not always. Can't I be open to counter arguments, criticisms, data, and won't we all be better off if we all admit to that?
Thank you so much.
I'm doing it again. Anna, was that your one question for now? Because you said you had a whole bunch of simple questions. Did you?
It was actually 4 questions, but each very short, so they all fit in.
Wow.
The fault is mine for giving long answers to short questions.
No, not at all. I thought that was very efficient.
Better than the other way around.
It was all well handled and very efficient. Well, good work, everyone. All right, Jonathan.
So I want to mildly and gently offered the skeptical other side of Anna's question, which is not at all rejecting that the spaces where we need rationality, we want a great deal more of it profoundly more effectively. But building on sort of the terminological fuzziness that we mentioned, that we are all rationalizing, using these tools to justify things at the very least to ourselves, but that is different than going to the moon, using knowledge and science to achieve a goal. And then the opposite is sort of, to suggest that someone is irrational is like a quarter as bad as calling them a racist, right? Like, this is a bad thing that nobody ever wants to be. And so I guess what I'd invite you to speculate on, or wonder if you've ever observed, is there a temptation that rationalism is expanding or could expand to fill the void that religion used to occupy? That it might become a more totalizing human philosophy? And my one illustration would be, you mentioned Odysseus lashing himself to the mast and muting his sailors. He wanted to have the human experience of listening to the sirens. The most rational choice would have been just don't go to the island. But there was an element of goal selection that wasn't remotely rational. He wanted to have an experience of beauty, of an audible experience. And there's a tremendous amount of that strikes me as not the place where we apply these tools. And I just wonder if you've encountered that, experienced it, observed it, or worried about it.
Yeah, a couple of things. So, well, absolutely. And that takes us back to how we began the conversation with Hume's statement that reason must always be in service of the passions. In this case, one of the passions would be to experience the aesthetic pleasure of hearing the siren songs. And in a sense, that's not irrational. It's irrational to steer your ship onto the rocks, because given the one package, hear the siren songs and then your skeletons rot, get bleached to the sun, or do without the siren songs and you live to see your family. Everyone would agree that package number 2 is better than package number 1. But if you get a package number 3, that is, you get to hear the songs and you get to return home to your wife and kids, that's the most rational of all. Now, setting the goal of hearing the siren songs is not by itself rational. And at the end of the day, our goals are ultimately set by evolution and natural selection and their consequences in our lives. And so there's no arguing for or against them, but we can argue when we have multiple conflicting goals, which ones ought we to prioritize, and how can we perhaps get the best combinations of several of them. Whether reason can fill the space formerly occupied by religion, well, that can be stated in 2 ways. I mean, in a bad way, that is, that if by religion one has in mind the dogmatism, the intolerance, the orthodoxy, the Puritanism, then we wouldn't be gaining much if we just flipped one arbitrary set of values for another. But if it's that in the past, given the desire to, say, figure out the origin of the universe, we relied on scripture, now we rely on science. So in that sense, science is replacing religion. That would be kind of a good thing. That is, it is filling that need, but it's doing it in the way that we should welcome. Now, I think what you might have had in mind was, could people who claim to be acting on reason actually be using that as a pretext for other self-interested motives? And of course they can and they do. And as you say, calling someone irrational can be an insult, a pejorative. To the extent that people are doing that, though, they may be saying they're rational. That doesn't mean that they are rational, and that has to be distinguished. So someone who uses rationality as a pretext to just impose a new orthodoxy, yeah, people do that, and they shouldn't. Doing that is bad, and doing that is not rational. And that is one of the built-in kind of magical powers almost of rationality, which is that it can always step back and look at an instance of itself and recursively, and always examine instances of rationality and ask the meta question, gee, is that claim to rationality rational? And sometimes it isn't, and that's how we make intellectual and philosophical and scientific progress. We have a replicability crisis in social science and in epidemiology and other fields. That's in some sense, that's a failure of science as it has been practiced up to that point. In another sense, it's kind of what science always has to consist of, namely scrutinizing its own practices, identifying flaws, and trying not to repeat them.
Indeed, you got at the third thing, which I did have in mind, which is the not so much the orthodoxy or dogmatism or full explanation, but more, what does it mean to be human? I come from a Christian background, and it's taken as a given in a great deal of circumstances. Once you do that, it fills and defines the entirety of your life. It defines your sexual choices and your dietary choices and your neighborhood choices and all of that. And I kind of want to go, I want to be a good rationalist in the 2/3 of my life where I use those tools to make good decisions and perceive good goals. But I want to hear the sirens, and I want to go to Yosemite.
That's right. Yeah, quite right. And indeed, one can, and religions often do offer those goals in life, and it's probably not so bad to reflect on them. One can, at the end of the day, accept them, whether the ultimate value is accepting Jesus's sacrifice as a way of redeeming humanity, or lighting the candles on the Sabbath and then putting on tefillin. And if those make life meaningful to the person who adopts them, then there's no gainsaying it. On the other hand, it's also not terrible to reflect and say, is that ultimately what ought to define the best life for me? And for many people, it may not.
Well, I'll out myself and say that Enlightenment Now is one of my personal holy texts. So thank you for writing it.
Thank you.
I'll say ditto on that. Greg.
Okay, to go around again, one thing that really stands out to me from many of the philosophers who've praised reason, particularly in antiquity, was, you see this in Plato and Aristotle, is they're saying like the difference between being rational and irrational, between being a human being and being a mere animal, or between, if you are a human being, turning on your mind and using it and not, is like the difference between an animal and a plant. It's one of these kind of huge scale differences within the living realm. And this is particularly how Aristotle thinks. And I wonder if there's a way to integrate that with the idea that some of our basic drives or motivations come from evolution, which of course Aristotle didn't know about, but from things that we share with the lower animals. Like if you think about a dog, like you might think that the dog smells and sniffs and runs around and eats and does all the dog things in order to keep cellular metabolism going on for the dog. But it seems to me just as accurate to say, for a dog, cellular metabolism is for living a dog kind of life and running around and sniffing and eating, and you can't really put one before the other. The whole thing is the end. And if for us, the stuff we have in common with dogs, some things smelling good and tasting good and feeling good and so forth, is part of our system of motivation, and clearly it is, right? And yet those things are very often going to conflict with one another across a life. Part of what we might develop to get on living a life across a life is a different type of motivation, a type of motivation that involves thinking long range, that involves integrating, that involves ideas. And just like the dog directs itself by smell and stuff, not just by physiological things. And if that's part of what we do, and the ideals that we guide ourselves by abstractly are part of what guide us, it doesn't seem right to me to say that those are then just for the sake of satisfying our urges, our hungers, our lusts, in just the way that it doesn't seem right to me to say that for the dog, sniffing and running and living a dog life is just for the sake of cellular metabolism. It seems like we have a different kind of self-direction reason that the dog has, that's kind of grounded in the stuff the dog has too, but it's different. And that to me is the idea that there's this other motivational system built on top of the other one. It feels to me like it's part of what I mean when I want to deny that reason's the slave to the passions. I think it's maybe representative democracy of the passions, or built on the passions somehow, but not slavishly. So that's my bit of pushback to the Humeanism here.
No, it's interesting. Several points there. One of them is that there is, in interpreting behavior of animals, and for that matter humans, and for that matter plants, one does have to distinguish between rationality at two completely different levels. One of them is there's a kind of rationality that is inherent to the process of natural selection itself, in that it eventuates in features that look as if they were designed, that are highly non-random, that look as if they had been designed in service of a goal, such as the design of the heart and the eye and the various instincts and drives of animals, where there's a rationality to them. But of course, the animal itself has never figured those out. It doesn't have to. We have some of those ourselves, but on top of that, we have one of our adaptations is this open-ended, recursive, combinatorial cognitive system. That's the peculiar adaptation of Homo sapiens, and it does open up this whole universe, this whole space of ideas that is pretty much closed to every other animal. Now we are animals, but we are this peculiar animal with this ability, and once we have that ability to ask no end of questions, including how ought we to devote our worldly efforts, then it is true that the game changes, somewhat. Now I say somewhat because at the end of the day, it's going to be most value systems, not all, but a lot of them are going to prioritize things like life and and health and happiness. Not necessarily, because of course there are religions that say that the ultimate goal of striving is the world to come, not this life. And if you're martyred at the age of 30 for bliss in paradise forever, it's a good trade-off. So even that can be questioned. But to the extent that health, happiness, social connection, knowledge are figure into even our cognitively constructed value system, they are in a sense rooted in evolution, and maybe even more deeply than evolution, in the sense that any system that is incarnate, that is not just angels having abstract discourse, has to involve certain preconditions, such as that physical entity did not fall apart under the relentless tug of entropy and dissolution, that it gathered enough energy to power the thinking process, that it had enough of a drive for self-preservation, that it hasn't fallen apart, that it had enough knowledge to engage in that very discussion that we are now having, that it have enough social connection, that it could cooperate with other rational agents. So if you even sort of set down, well, what has to even be in place for us even to ask the question and have the discussion that we're having, it does impose some boundary conditions on what our goals ought to be. And those, and some of those goals, not coincidentally, are ones that correspond to some of our evolutionary drives, like comfort and safety and self-preservation and health and social connectedness. And for that matter, love and sex and social companionship, because in a social species, those were prerequisites to the species having evolved intelligence and continuing to exist. So I'm sorry, it's a little bit of a roundabout answer to your question, but it is a profound question of, namely, do our ultimate goals, are they things that have to be justified? And if so, how, and are those justifications completely independent of the drives that presumably were installed in us by natural selection?
What you're suggesting, is very much up my line of thinking as an ethicist. That is sympathetic to my own thinking, but you might think that the kind of thinking that's involved in coming up with our ultimate standards and ultimate values and what we're after in life isn't just means end thinking to how to satisfy our drives, but is nonetheless constrained or directed or oriented, when it's done well, by an understanding of our biological nature and of the kinds of things you're talking about. That at least that's how I want to think about the foundations of ethics.
Yeah, if so taking into account the fact that people, we are organisms, and we really do prefer to be, comfortable than uncomfortable, and healthy than sick, and alive than dead, and loved and hated, and all of those things, then we have to respect those. And I was suggesting something even beyond, a level beyond that, that maybe even it's not just that we're stuck with them because we're primates, though we are, but it's not an accident, it's not a coincidence that we're stuck with them, because if we weren't, it's, we wouldn't be here to have this conversation in the first place. Even if there was some process by which intelligent agents could come into existence other than Darwinian natural selection, even if we were designed by a super intelligence, we'd still have to have drives that keep ourselves, alive and in discourse with others, and knowledgeable, and not about to fall apart. And those would have probably overlap a lot with the drives that natural selection did give us. So there might be even a meta justification, but we might be getting several levels too abstract.
We don't mind. This group can take it. I'm tempted to follow up, but I know also your time is very limited, Dr. Pinker. So if you have time for one more question, looks like
sure. Let's go. Why don't we go till 3:30, if that's okay with everyone?
Amazing. Yeah, thank you. And Isabella, take us away.
Hi, thank you. So I feel like for 25 years, I've been trying to answer the same question or at least I've realized it right now. I've read almost every one of your books, and I was as a student at University of Toronto about 25 years ago of Keith Stanovich. And so I remember his like normative thinking, and my paper that I was so proud of in grad school that I wrote was the role of emotion in rational thinking models. And I got an A+ because it apparently seemed like this amazing thing to think about emotions in these normative models and biases and so on. And I feel like I'm still stuck there. And I feel like a lot of the questions that we are taught, like that Gregory has brought up and Jonathan has come around, comes to this place of still thinking about, I'm just wondering why we're still writing large, very intelligent discourses about rationality in approximately not the same way, in that it has to still be now translated to a new generation, but still there feels like there's something that we are continued to be thinking about that's very individual based, and that does, although the social elements are brought in, they don't feel like they're integrated as a base for these theoretical models. So here's my question. Why? If you know Jim Cohn's work in social baseline theory and things like that, we know that we actually think entirely differently when we're alone. And that aloneness it's a time of stress. We're neurologically in a stressful context. Our brains work differently when we're alone rather than in social context. Our cognitive resources are allocated differently when we're alone, and so on. And so I think there's a really interesting and I think these questions around religion and these questions about the affects and emotions get to this point about what would a model of rational, moral existence be if we started with the evolutionary social baseline of our essence, rather than starting with the individual rational being. And it's a very broad question, but I'm just wondering your thinking about it.
I'm glad you brought up Keith Stanovich. He was a big influence in writing rationality, and I'm a huge fan of his work, which continues to be timely, because his most recent book was on the my side bias. He titled the book The Bias That Divides Us, and he's done the most extensive work on whether rationality is the same thing as intelligence, namely what intelligence tests measure. And the answer seems to be that they overlap, but not completely. That in general, smarter people are more rational, but there are an awful lot of smart, irrational people, and vice versa. Well, I think we do, and this is a theme that has come through the conversation, that our best rationality really is social, in the sense that we submerge our opinions, our interests to a larger epistemic community of scientists and journalists and rational citizens in open intellectual discourse, that we agree to what makes us rational is not just how brilliant your brain is, or my brain is, or anyone's brain is, but what happens when you put brains together, cooperating under a regime that is designed to point toward objectivity, rationality, and so on. So that's really where our hopes for rationality lie. Of course, and it is also true that the tools of rationality, normative models like Bayesian reasoning and probability and rational choice theory and correlation and causation, are themselves the legacy of people who lived before us and had epiphanies and brainchildren and inspirations and wrote them down, and other people said, wow, this is a really good idea, let's continue to teach that. And we are the lucky beneficiaries of that collective toolkit that's been passed down to us. So very much rationality hinges on our being a social species. Of parochial interest to me, that's why we have language. Language is I think language evolved precisely because we're both a cognitive species and a social species. All that cognitive wisdom would go to waste if we could not share it. And conversely, we could never become as smart as we are if we had to reinvent the wheel, every wheel for ourselves, as opposed to benefiting from other people's trial and error and other people's strokes of ingenuity. That's why we have language, and that's how language multiplies our rationality. In terms of emotion, again, it's a theme that's come up a number of times. And emotion in the sense of loving your children, loving your spouse, appreciating beauty, enjoying the siren song, enjoying delicious food and the beauty of nature and culture. Those are, though they are emotional, they are, I think, what Hume had in mind when he talked about the passions, and there's nothing irrational about pursuing them. Other than the two provisos that we've already talked about, namely that emotion now might conflict with emotion later, and my emotion might conflict with your emotion. And so those are two cases in which we've got to kind of constrain our emotions for our own good and the good of everyone else.
Can I just add one thing? Because the one thing I wanted to say is that although, I'm a part of a science community and a therapist community and so on, I didn't quite mean that kind of construction and the meta construction around those social, organizational, or institutional. What I mean is that if you are next to somebody, your friend, and you're looking at a hill, as you well know, these studies show that you look at the hill and you see it, you perceive it rationally as less steep when you're with your friend than when you do when you're alone, or the backpack that feels heavier, rationally feels heavier to you, and you make the choice of going forward or not, whether you have somebody that are your social resources and have your back or not. So the very act of deciding and making decisions, even as individual, has nothing, is very, very different than the kinds of decisions that we make when we're socially surrounded by either friends or close others and so on. And so I think it's that element of rationality that I care about, that in the moment self-organizing social element of rationality that I still feel is underdeveloped in some ways, but maybe I'm not reading the right places. Okay,
no, that is having another person, right there next to you at the time that you're thinking something through.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. Now that you're right. That is not something that I was alluding to before.
Yeah.
So if I can kind of tie a few of these themes together in a couple minutes we have left with you, Dr. Pinker, and sort of building off the emotion theme, but also looping back to this idea that you and Greg developed, that there's this cognitive apparatus that we evolved such that it changes the nature of the game in certain ways. And what I want to reflect on is that part of what's different about the game of having this cognitive faculty that reflects on itself and that that can ask infinite questions and formulate abstractions and develop kind of new values and new conceptions of the good, is that it can also not do those things, and that there's sort of no forcing mechanism. Right, that we can do those things, and or sort of, there are always the other kind of lower order shared animal drives that are available if we want to kind of be moved by them. In other words, we can make reason just a slave of our passions, and or we can reflect on what those passions are, and do they still make sense in our current context, and how are they going to play out over our lifetime. And I feel like a lot of what we're talking about is sort of the choice of like that there's some sort of there's an irreducible kind of agency involved as part of having this reflective capacity, that we can actually try to kind of step outside ourselves and ask those third person questions and kind of reflect on, okay, but what does this person know that I don't? Or, you know, how else might I see this situation? Or we can just go through the motions of doing that while really just, you know, chasing after the marshmallow or whatever. And I guess, and the kind of tie into emotion there is that we also, you know, CBT teaches us that we do affect our own experience of emotion through the way that we think about things over time and through the experiences that we sort of expose ourselves to, including, you know, do we seek the company of friends? Do we make ourselves vulnerable? Do we take certain kinds of risks, etc.? And that to me also seems like one of the ways we can leverage having this reflective faculty or not, right? We can also kind of coast on autopilot a lot of the time. And then we end up having the same kinds of emotion. You know, our emotions can be more reflective of how we were treated when we were 5 than the community we live in today. So I guess just, yeah, if you wanted to riff on any of the themes that all brings up.
Yes, certainly. And the thing about humans that makes us, I think, you know, outliers among primates and mammals is that our emotions are less predictably triggered by particular stimuli, particular sensory inputs, and depend a lot on how we interpret them. And that is we ascribe intentions to others. We react completely differently if something was a accidental slight versus a deliberate insult, or whether someone had, perhaps maybe it wasn't deliberately compromising our interests, but they had a good reason, or they didn't have a good reason, and you know that determines how angry you get. And I imagine, again, this is your area of expertise more than mine, but my understanding of a lot of cognitive behavior therapy and other kinds of cognitive therapies is that does give a little chink, a leverage point for the therapist in trying to get people to use what rationality they have to steer the course of their life in better directions. That is, to think twice, to stop, to try to step back on your own interpretation of events, reframe them, reconstrue them, reconceptualize them in ways that will ultimately make you more satisfied, happier, better relationships, better life choices. Would that be a reasonable way of characterizing a lot of the rationale of cognitive therapies?
Beautifully put. Yeah, and I would say as part of that, you're also helping people rethink their goals, right? And rethink, you know, what's possible to me, what's worthwhile for me to pursue, kind of what is the range of possible futures that I want to bring within my reach. And so that's one of the ways, I think we transcend.
Yeah, and in that, I think that I think that some of the even abstract kind of nerdy cognitive tools could be of use, such as the theory of rational choice. I have a chapter on that in Rationality, and contrary to the stereotype that it depicts people or even advises people to be ruthless, you know, self-interest maximizers, it actually doesn't, because the theory of laying out alternatives by the weighted sum of their value to you, weighted by their probability, and choosing the one with the highest expected value. What could go into those calculations are things like social connectedness and benefiting those you love, and that goes into the calculus. But thinking that way, even though it sounds, you know, very nerdy, Spockian, you know, uber rational, is a way of clarifying ultimately what matters to you. And I think it can have a salubrious effect, as long as you remember that utility, benefit, value doesn't mean dollars and cents. It means whatever it is that you value. But thinking in that way forces you to ask yourself, what do you value? And are you making the choices that are consistent with your values, whatever they are?
Yeah, absolutely. I literally, in Psychology Today, I have an article called Earning Your Own Trust, where I show an example pros cons table where I have clients quantify, okay, so how worth it is it for me to be honest with myself here, and how likely that each of these feared scenarios would happen and each of these, desired scenarios would happen if I were honest with myself versus if I self-deceived. So literally, like that's
That's
not
the theory of
okay,
rational choice. Yeah.
right there. I'm putting it to use, but in a hopefully more ennobled and sort of distinctly human way. Thank you so much, Dr. Pinker. This
My
has been,
pleasure, Gena,
transformative
and
and
thank you, Anna, for making this all possible. And thanks to all of you for your questions. Some of you I have interacted with in the past and enjoy the opportunity to do it again. Some of you I've met for the first time. Some of you I didn't meet, but saw you as little postage stamps on the screen. And in all those cases, I thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you so much for coming and joining us. This has been fantastic. And we will continue, as we always do, talk about your work behind your back. We will keep you posted how it went. Thank you so much.
All gushing.
Bye, everyone, and thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, Dr. Pinker. And thank you for what you do. All right. So if anybody feels emboldened now that the really famous person has left the room.
There are so many
Any
people
other
who
thoughts?
haven't had a chance to ask any questions. So this is us inviting you to jump in. There are no unqualified questions. There are unqualified answers, but questions can come from.
Yeah, let's be clear. There are plenty of those to go around. Yeah, Pooja.
Yeah, hi. Sorry, I was in and out because of VPN, and that's why I didn't want to ask my question in case he had already addressed it. But I thought I heard Dr. Pinker mention, it's nice to have institutions that will direct our collective rationality. So my question to him would be, did he mean, like teaching thinking methods and stuff like that? And I was wondering if any school people had approached him and if he would be open to talking curriculums and stuff like that for kids. If he had plans.
I'd love to ask him that question. I don't know. I don't know if anyone here happens to know if he's already had any kind of, forays. I mean, he's an educator in that he, teaches at a university, right, at Harvard, where, a lot of smart kids go. But as to, I definitely think there would be really interesting curricular, implications and value added for younger children and grades. So I don't know if anyone has insight on.
Is Jason still here? I think he did. He went to one of the progress school events, probably.
You mean progress? Oh, you mean the workshop for teens? Actually, now that you mention it, that's possible. So maybe at least one thing that was done specifically, but yeah, maybe that's something to ask him on Twitter when he retweets our YouTube link to this.
Thank you.
Thanks, Pooja. Tyler. Hey.
Hi, I wanted to ask a question.
Introduce yourself, Tyler. Just because I know you doesn't mean.
My name's Tyler, and I'm a student at Oregon State University studying psychology. I had a question on the topic of getting rationality to be more popular in the culture, or at least more valued. And I was curious what your assessment of the culture is on what the biggest obstacle is, because one obstacle would be that people just don't value reason as much as they should, such as like, oh, well, reason and rationality is great, but it's not the most important thing. There's other things. Or if the bigger obstacle is that people do value reason and rationality, but they don't understand it, or they don't know how to use it as much. Like they might think, oh, well, of course, reason is the most important thing. I'm rational all the time, and they're in fact rationalizing. So I was curious what you think is the bigger obstacle.
I guess with the second one, I would put it as they think they value reason, but they don't understand it because whatever it is they value presumably isn't at least this current robust conception of reason that we're talking about, right? If we do distinguish between rationalizing and reason is the thing where you're actually trying to sort of figure it out and actually trying to get to the best, best solution, live the best life. As to what we think is actually, I mean, I'm sure it's not going to come down to kind of one of those answers, but I imagine, I mean, I guess one thing to say about it, and I'll let any philosophers in the room also weigh in because I know you thought about this, but like, it's really hard. I mean, here we're, Dr. Pinker, who's one of the smartest, most thoughtful defenders and champions of reason, I think, alive today, has disagreements with others of us who've thought about this a lot, and we don't necessarily all mean the same things by some of these terms. And is it just instrumental, or can you also apply it to morality and to means in it? Like, this stuff is really hard to understand. When you say, well, maybe they just don't understand it, I feel like there's a lot that goes into that, success condition. Like, do we all fully understand it? Do any of us, like, how robust is our understanding of it, of the people sitting in this room? So I think that's probably at least some part of it is it's an achievement and a really difficult and sort of, cumulative task that has, that many have passed the baton kind of through history to trying to really understand and like not just in in some pure kind of detached intellectual way, but like actually understand how to live it and what does it mean to live it, and is it at odds with passion and emotion, or is it somehow right? I think first we have to decide on what it is. Then we can figure out, how bought in are people and why aren't they more bought in.
Gena, could I add an answer to that?
Yeah, of course.
I sort of think.
Sorry, I have my hand up because I would like to jump in to respond to that.
Yes.
I thought you were next in line for a question. I'm sorry.
Sorry. Do you want to jump it here, Anna, and then Jonathan? I'll
go, sure but yeah, just like bear in mind that there's the hand raising feature.
Fair. So do we want to?
I was just going to suggest that publicly announcing when you change your mind about something is like a huge cultural value in this regard. I think because everything is now political and people that change their minds are perceived as hypocrites, and being irrational is like being a racist. I think if we just normalize the value of, I used to think X and now I think Y because I learned W, and like that being a normal thing, and everybody gets applauded when they do that, even when they change to not quite what you think the right answer is.
Yeah. Anna? You want to jump in now?
Yeah. So this is not a question. This is something actually I'm inviting the group to jump in. And throughout the conversation, I was thinking of how around the time when I went to university, the new atheist movement started, and how many intellectual careers that changed literally in front of my eyes. Right? Richard Dawkins, who is a biologist, went from talking about genes and the role of evolution and how we approach art to talking about extremely contemporary questions. Sam Harris, neuroscientist, Pinker himself, Hitchens, previously wrote about politics and cultural trends. And then something happened that brought these people together, and it completely changed career trajectories and access to fame, access to loudest mics. And this fascinates me, that we've been living in this 20-year period when we just talk about rationality very differently. And we actually have an extremely multidisciplinary crew of thinkers who participate in these discussions. And yeah, I'm just wondering how you guys experience this period, and why do you think this is? Why do you think this is now? Probably that's my question. Like, if we are so evolved in the 21st century, why did it become so important at the turn of the millennium to talk about these things so emphatically once again, and by the greatest minds? So it's not like a fringe movement, right? It's completely mainstream people basically resetting their career GPSs and be like, from now on, I'm writing about why there is no God, and you didn't see that coming. So I'm super, super interested what you guys think about that with the hand raise feature.
Am I Am I allowed to subvert the order and like cold call on someone?
You're the boss.
Okay, I don't actually even know if he's there because his camera's off, but Greg, I would really love to hear your take on this question. If I may.
I am here, but was distracted, so I need to have the essence of the question summarized for me. It was the new atheists, and everything changed when the new atheists came on the scene. There was another element to it that I missed.
And what's up with that?
Their career. So there was this very distinct cultural movement before the IDW, before what we call the alt-right today, or however you want to categorize, that seemed to have emerged around 25 years ago. Very high level, very accomplished thinkers from a variety of different academic disciplines joined it, not always in agreement with each other. And I keep wondering, like, what was it about that kind of turn of the millennium moment when we were supposed to have been so evolved already, so rational, that called for this enormous reallocation of intellectual capital, right? To me, it's not a mystery, but it's extremely interesting. And I think there's something underexplored in that.
I've always thought it was a response to 9/11. So you had a tremendous—
I knew he'd have an interesting take on this.
A tremendous event that, was on everybody's mind and was shaping government policy, and, everybody was concerned about 9/11 and what are we going to do about it? And a bunch of people who had long been atheists, and it was caused by, at least arguably, it was caused by people who were religious, arguably religiously motivated, at least they claimed it to be. And so I think there was a segment of people who had never been religious, who had been secular humanists of various stripes, but who didn't see that subject as a thing to crusade about. It was just one fact about them, but who diagnosed religiosity as a cause of the thing we were all in the world concerned about now, and who saw the mainstream religiosity in America and elsewhere as, in one way or another, similar to or contributory to or stopping us from thinking about what was wrong with terrorism, different versions of that for different people. So they decided, we want to be louder about this issue and this issue in particular. Certainly that was the case with Sam Harris, right? Think of Letter to a Christian Nation and think of everything that he went on to write about Islam after that. I think it was also the case with some of the others, Julia Sweeney, who I think was the most intellectually deep commentator among the new atheists, although not the most prestigious. But I think Letting Go of God is the finest intellectual product out of that movement. And she talks about that having been a motive for her somewhere, I think she does. And Dennett and British, the guy who coined the term meme. Dawkins, sorry. Yeah. Had always been on about these sort of things, sort of, but I think that also, my sense is had a role in his prioritizing that issue at that time. So that's my sense, but we'd have to ask all of them.
Cool. Okay, I'm going to continue the queue, but this is fascinating. I'll be curious if we come back around. I'll be curious, Anna, what you think about that, or anyone else, of course. All right, Jade, I know you've waited patiently. Hi.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jade. This is my first salon, so quite exciting. Yeah, I'm a biomedical scientist, so I work in pathology. Nothing to do with philosophy or anything like that, but I do like reading about it. So yeah, the question I was going to ask Stephen Pinker was similar as Jonathan's, which was why I put my hand back down, but it was just this whole idea of religion, and people talk about the hole that's left because of because of the sort of lack of religion, and it being filled with social justice and sort of passion for this sort of gender and race issues, and people feeling this need to have meaning in life and stuff like that. And I'm just wondering, like I've heard, speaking of Dawkins, he thinks that the idea that that we need some sort of God to look up to is really I've heard him say it's sort of quite condescending, and we shouldn't put ourselves down like that, and we should just sort of revere sort of you know, science and rationality and that sort of thing. But I feel like there's, you know, I wonder, are there just some people that are attracted to that? Do you know what I mean? So clearly he is, because he's a scientist. I mean, I'm a scientist, you know, I'm attracted to being rational. I like that, but you know, some people just don't, you know, they don't, and is, you know, if we're religion rational, then what can we sort of replace it with? And, you know, would rationality need a sort of story or something, you know, to make it sort of attracted to people that aren't just attracted to, you know, religion seems to, you know, I guess.
Jane, you're cutting out a yeah, I think I caught most of that, and it makes a lot of sense. It's a great question. Did others catch? Well, I don't know if it was just cutting out for me, or well, in any case,
I missed quite a bit of it. It was choppy, and I was interested.
Sorry. Let me see if I can piece together kind of the essence of the question. Or also just a good comprehension check for me. Uh-oh, Jade, you might be frozen, but on the hope that you can still hear.
Oh no.
Oh, well, you can, okay, but can you are you still, uh-oh, did we lose Jade? You know what? We're gonna circle back. We're gonna give her a chance to fix whatever the Wi-Fi issue, and then we're gonna circle back because I think it's a great question, and I want her to have a chance to hear whatever answers we riff on. So for now, Josh, so we're going through the J's here. So Josh.
Hey, yeah, I'm Josh. I'm a software engineer. I was in the Bay Area for a long time, and now I live in Colorado. Actually, I want to go back to Anna's question. I was wondering about this. Made me think in the 9/11. I've thought of New Atheism as primarily like an American or maybe an Anglophone thing. Is it like, are there? Was it influential on the continent? Are there a bunch of continental, like European writers that I just don't know them because I don't speak any English, any language besides English?
Good question.
Is this to me as the resident European? Yeah.
Kind of that way. Or any other resident.
I mean, I spent that time. I was mainly in the UK at the time. Kind of in my understanding, maybe the mainstreamization of New Atheism started after, like as a response to 9/11 in my interpretation as well, and especially the kind of reactionism of the George W. Bush government or their rhetoric. But really it started earlier. Right? If you kind of like poke around YouTube, you will see that like 1997, 98, these things were already there. I think for Dawkins, the book that I read by him, where it feels that kind of he went from writing only about science into writing more about culture, was the book is I think called Unweaving the Rainbow, and it's from 1997. So, you know, we can like theorize the internet and globalism and what, you know, made people suddenly worried that there will be a clash of civilization, and what comes after the Cold War, you know, the enemy, quote unquote, no longer being, you know, the godless Soviet Union, then who, and then you continue fill in the blanks. So regarding of, or, you know, depending on what you're scared of. But I think in Western Europe, there definitely was a huge trend. I mean, Ayaan Hirsi Ali is Dutch, right? I mean, partly, or by immigration. And currently we see that in the illiberal movement, there are some parts of this thinking that survive, but somehow, you know, kind of similarly to how Pinker was talking about how you can just rationalize your doomsday cult's prediction of when the world ends not ending. It's like you double down. So they're not, but like I'm Hungarian, and they don't seem to be bothered by the fact that they are super Christian, and then this is a new atheist movement that doesn't matter. Somehow in like the cognitive gymnastics, if you really want to, anything can be reconciled. So I think it was very, very influential. You know, in France, it competes with an extremely strong, you know, critical theory, left-wing, socialist, intellectual kind of monopoly. But look, they just had an election between two right-wing contenders, and that's kind of not something that usually happens in France. So I would say yes, it seems to be, at least in Europe, very influential.
Interesting. Yeah, I have perhaps luckily very little of genuine insight to add to this topic, though I find it fascinating. And so hopefully that'll help me to keep the queue moving. But anyone and everyone just feel free to continue to weigh in on this, because I'm fascinated by kind of whole historical analysis. Okay, Jonathan.
I was just going to add another answer to Anna's question, which is, or add on to Greg's answer, which is, I think I agree that 9/11 was pretty influential in, the influence of the new atheist movement. But I've also just been paying attention to how small groups of dedicated people create tremendous growth in this space that you can't imagine. And so, like, the way that the new atheists fed off each other was fascinating. Sam Harris's deeply insightful and careful analysis, and Hitchens' tremendous wit, and how any one of them could not have done even 100th of what they did together, because it was interesting to hear them talk to each other. I just finished reading The Founders, which is about the PayPal mafia, and recognizing that every major tech company you've heard of in the last 20 years, like, all worked at PayPal in 2003. And the ways that they worked together and the values they instilled, and the fact that this was one of these early tech finance things, just yielded this set of values and this group of ambitious people that, even once PayPal was sold, went off to do dozens and dozens of even more magnificent, enormous things. And so I'm just intrigued by the collision of a small group of dedicated people and an event that changes the world, and the fact that they come together, and the tremendous amount of luck around that.
I think there's a lot of wisdom to be captured in that model for those of us who want to catalyze big change. Maybe some subset of us in this room.
And I'll notice that Jade is back with seemingly functional
Jade.
Wi-Fi if you wanted to throw back to her.
Yeah, so Jade, let's circle back, because I think you had a great question. If you
So
can
sorry
give
about
us
that.
the one, it's real, we've all been there, it's all good.
I don't know why it happened at that time, but anyway.
Because it's just how these things go. I'm sure it's one of Murphy's laws. So do you mind giving us the sort of one sentence executive summary of the question to put it back in all our minds, including mine?
Yes. So let me try and gather my thoughts. So basically, thinking about, what might be a whole, some would describe as a whole left by the sort of lack of religion, secular, those of us who are secular, looking for meaning in life. And, we might be attracted to these theories, using rationality to find our goal, but it's sort of similar to what you were talking about. What is that goal? And it's, we're still sort of trying to find that. And but if we want to try and sort of, rationally look at what's important and things like that, and also to encourage others to use that method, then I guess, how can we make it more of an attractive way to do things? And I was just thinking about sort of, what religion does have, and what makes it so attractive is, and the stories that it tells, and the way it sort of has really brings people together socially and stuff. And it's tricky. I just find it difficult to think how we can do, how we can make sort of rationality attractive to more people, which is along the same lines as what many other people were asking. So
yeah, it's a really excellent question, and I think a lot of the wisdom that's sort of emerged out of this conversation, I mean, including, who was it that that said, and I echoed that Enlightenment Now is their holy text. Who was that? That was Jonathan. That kind of that resonated. I mean, there's a certain way in which I think when you asked in the first iteration, Jade, you had asked, like, do we need stories? Do we need to like narrativize it? Do we need some sort of it? And I think there's a sense in which, absolutely, because I think this kind of comes back to the discussion of like, is rationality purely just this like means optimization, tool, or is there a certain new conception of the good life and a certain like inspiring and ennobled way of experiencing human nature that rationality both allows and instantiates, right? And I think that's like, I believe the latter. And I think that really leaning into the latter and like doing the work to articulate and to illustrate like what that is, like what is the vision of human life that we can all access and experience for ourselves and bring to the remaining days of our lives in order to reap the kind of fullest, deepest wealth of joy and experience and prosperity and fulfillment that we can. Like, being a rational person is what unlocks that. Like, I think we kind of have to be able to make that bridge, to build that bridge for people. First, we have to like decide if we believe it. I believe it, but I feel like it's also, it's like I've done maybe 10 years of thinking about what that means to me. And I've gone back and forth on different, definitions and understandings of it. So I think that's like, it's a cognitive challenge first of like, what is the role of reason and truth pursuit and rationality in our lives, and how does it support our passions? And a lot of my current research is on actually like moralizing honesty and rationality, not in the way that I think it's often thought of, where it's like, now this is the bludgeon that I'm gonna, hit you over the head with, but rather like recognizing that it's a really fundamental and chosen character trait that nobody can force upon us, that ultimately like we cultivate from within through all these little choices about like, do I actually face the facts, or do I kind of just tell myself give myself a rationalization? Do I publish my data even when it's not what I wanted it to be because I care about like actually advancing scientific knowledge, or do I kind of just put it in the drawer because I don't want to look bad to my colleagues, right? Like, because scientists face this every day too, in various ways. Like, to ennoble that, to kind of come to see and come to celebrate like how courageous that is and how hard that is and how rewarding that is as a virtue and as a practice, to like, the way I've put it sometimes is like self-honesty, which I really mean rationality, kind of the choice to be rational, that really it's the difference between, it's like loving life and existence so much that you want it for real and not just for pretend. Like, that's what inspires me. That's the story. And I think it's, it's not just a pretend story. Like, I actually think it captures something real about the kind of human condition. And I don't know if it's what will inspire others, but anyway, those are kind of my 2 cents on.
That's beautiful. Love it.
Thank you. I realize we are at the hour. I'm happy to stay at least for the remaining 3 questions that we have hands up for now. And obviously you can come and go as you need to, but hugely appreciate everyone's questions and presence. This has been a joy. So if you need to head out, I'll understand. Otherwise, let's at least wrap up the discussion with these 3. Okay, Colin, I believe you were next.
Hi. Okay, so I'm Colin. I'm a software developer in London. I'm going to frustrate myself by kind of circling back to Anna's question about new atheists.
I knew this was the Jolly Joker question. No, I'm joking. I had no idea. I thought you guys would be like, boo. For appreciating my non-question question.
Well, I think it's a really fascinating. Okay, I'm going to be a bit disorganized in these thoughts, but hopefully you can bear with me. So I pointed to those 2 Scott Alexander essays in the chat about new atheism, so why it became unfashionable, and his fascinating theory that that's actually what morphed into wokeism, which is a really interesting idea. But so this is kind of what makes me pessimistic. A big part of, okay, so I think new atheism kind of came about, so the term seems to have come up in like 2006 or something, but I think the constant discussions that people were having about religion, true or false, actually predated 9/11. And okay, so then it becomes a thing as new atheism. But that thing as new atheism is so tied up in the coalitions that people can form. So there was a coalition of people describing themselves as new atheists. And that coalition lasted until about 2012 or something like that. And then it fell apart, and new atheism became kind of unfashionable. And that's really interesting, because that means, well, okay, let's assume that we have something in common with new atheists. If they can become unfashionable, what else can become unfashionable? Including potentially rationality. And what sort of, and so my pessimistic view of this is that this is so much driven by people forming coalitions and then dissolving coalitions when they become less useful. That, like, I would love it if, the principles that Gena just described so eloquently were something that we could sort of, incorporate into our lives for, the rest of our lives. And yet the temptation to get sort of sucked into coalitions, the temptation to, I'm someone who spent a lot of time hanging around in the sort of less wrong kind of group. But then, the rationalists turned into the post-rats, and, everyone sort of dumps on Yudkowsky, I think a really unfair kind of way. So yeah, I'm for those sorts of reasons, I'm fascinated by to what extent we can hold up these principles, but I'm also really pessimistic about our ability to actually hold up a set of principles like that. Anyway, that's my rather pessimistic downer take.
I am muted. Sorry, all. I guess if I were to give my one sentence answer to that, the future isn't written. And I agree with you that things could get worse in coalitions, bad coalitions could win, and that bad groups can form just as easily, maybe more easily than virtuous groups. And I guess ultimately I kind of feel like, yeah, that this is the responsibility of being alive today and trying to be a force for good. It's like we have to grapple with that, with those possible futures, and figure out which ones we want to be, putting our weight behind. But I mean, I'm glad you raised it, because I don't want us getting complacent. David?
Yeah, so I guess I'll try to briefly have an answer to both Anna and Jade, try and combine them. I'm not sure that, I'm not totally convinced that we do have sort of a proliferation in a larger sense of these ideas. We might be suffering from the base rate fallacy, where lots of ideas were proliferating. And the last 20 years have been a time of internet, and there are many new groups forming, and it may not just be unique to rationality or new atheism or anything like that. It may just be that all kinds of ideas are all these outlier groups are able to find each other and form groups. I don't know anyone else who I've met in person who's heard of the word rationality in the way that we refer to it. Like, it's not a big movement anywhere I've been in the country, outside of Silicon Valley and a few different places. So I think, but I think it ties in a little bit with what Jade was talking about religion. where I think a lot of people are realizing that they can look for something other than religion to sort of fulfill that same role. And in my view, religion, one of the roles it fulfills is sort of community and group, but one of the other large ones is a sense of sort of outsourcing difficult decisions and morality, ethics, that are really hard choices. And if we can say, like, it's not me making this hard choice, it's my mom told me I have to do this, my dad, like God tells me that this is how I have to act, it sort of absolves us of a lot of the difficulties of how we have to interact with other human beings. Saying, like, I'm not saying no to you, I'm not saying I won't do this for you. It's not me. It's, the decision is outside of my hands. And Jade was sort of, I'm very much interested also in, like, Jade's question of how do we increase rationality outside of the people who already sort of believe it. Because that's sort of the practicality is, like, how do we make the world better in that particular dimension? And I always like to sort of think of analogies whenever I can, where there might be some information to be garnered from there. So I think of, like, an analogy to outsourcing decision making and sort of ethics or morality or whatever it is that you're outsourcing to religion. Similar in restaurant eating, like, we can cook ourselves. To come up with our own code of ethics is hard work. It's cognitive muscle exertion, as Gena, you sort of mentioned before. It's not easy. It feels hard. It feels like work, so we're lazy creatures and we're outsourcing. It's the same way that cooking food feels like work. And so a lot of times it's easier to cook, get food at a restaurant than to make it ourselves. But many people do also really enjoy cooking food. And there are ways that we've sort of, found to make cooking food, a pleasurable, enjoyable experience, and find the benefits of it, and the nutritional, the health, all these things. So it's the kind of thing that maybe if you build a habit, I'm not sure, I don't have a real answer to this, but I'm just thinking of it in terms of, like, step one is kind of defining what the problem is. And I don't know that I have the definition of it, but that's sort of my best guess, that it's easier to outsource. It feels easier. And, there are many places where we do this in life. And if we can look at some of those other areas and find how did we, have we successfully unoutsourced those things in other areas, then maybe we can apply some of those too. So anyway.
Yeah, I mean, beautifully put. And I think just building on that, I think a big part of the work of championing and advancing rationality, like, for real, is teaching people to actually to love that work and to embrace that responsibility, right? And to feel the embrace of that responsibility as a positive, right? As something life-bringing and virtuous and rewarding, and not as something like threatening or onerous or pointless, right? Or kind of wheel spinning. Because I think that's often by default where our culture ends up kind of falling on rationality. And yeah, the fact is, like, the onus is on us to do the work of actually motivating the work, because it's a lot of work and it's chosen. And there are always easy, cheap substitutes that we can fall back on. So Tyler, you can close us out.
Great. I didn't have a question. I just had a comment in response to Jade. Because I was thinking about, where are the stories that are really romanticizing and portraying the value of rationality? And I started thinking about, well, there really are a lot of stories today that do that, but they don't necessarily, but what could change is maybe how they emphasize it and how we interpret those stories. Because, like, a key example, I think, of stories, like very popular stories today that do this is crime stories, crime drama and detective dramas. They really emphasize, like, all right, we're going to follow the evidence, we're going to solve these problems, we're going to think hard, and we're going to figure this out, and we have the power to do that. Each episode closes, they find the criminal, and they serve justice. And then there's, like, even in other stories, this is not at the forefront, but it's there in a way that maybe isn't appreciated. I mean, like, I remember, I didn't watch How I Met Your Mother very often, but I remember there's this one episode where Ted kind of is, he's always reflecting in this show about like, why can't I meet someone who I can fall in love with and spend the rest of my life with? Like, what could I do differently? What am I doing wrong? And there's this one episode where he decides that like, you know what, nothing I'm doing is working. Let me look to other traditions. And there's other traditions where like the parents decide who their child should marry, and maybe there's something there. And so he decides to have his friends pick a partner for him, and then that doesn't work. And so he's back to square one. But it's like, it's not necessarily at the forefront, but it's there. He's like thinking about, what am I doing wrong? What could I be doing differently? And he tests something, and then that doesn't work. And so he tries something else. But there's a lot of stories like that in the culture. And I think maybe what could change is just how we think about them, or like how we interpret them. So that's all I had.
I'm very much with you. Yeah, I mean, I think often it's sort of implicit in a lot of stories, which I think is part of maybe what you're describing. I feel both, on the one hand, compelled to enforce my 3 questions decree, but on the other hand, really curious to hear your question, Jennifer. So maybe if it could be really quick, and then I'll bend the rule.
Thank you. Sorry, I raised my hand right as you said close us out, and then I was pushing all the buttons. I couldn't undo it. It's not even really a question. It was maybe it was to say, I think some of it may be a PR problem, and that rationalists are a really serious lot. And if I were looking at this from a place of being like, why should I join you? Do you like sell me some joy? Because it feels like everybody's so damn thinky, and where are the smiles? I want to go to a party. This is how Catholicism won, right? Like they're like, you can't be a fan, but we're still gonna have wine and dancing and festivals and things. And people are like,
as someone who went to a rationalist party once, I'm laughing so much.
In agreement, I assume. Yeah, like we could do better. Amen, Jennifer. Let's get on that. Let's start partying the rational way, but you know, in the sense of like, it's really joyful and fun.
You can tell that Jen lives in the Bay Area. You can tell from her description.
Is that true? Oh yeah, Jen, we skipped your introduction.
oh yeah, from San Francisco.
So yeah, did you just guess that, Anna? I'm impressed. Just telltale perspective. But yeah, I think that's an excellent note to end on. May we all be propelled to infuse rationality with the joy and the play and the fun that it, I think, rightly empowers and deserves. So let's all
Thank
go
you, Gena.
Show them how.
Thank you for arranging this. This is great.
Thank you, Gena, for hosting, and thank you, Anna, for arranging. I was in bed for 45 minutes scrolling through Twitter, and then I got the Discord message. Anna Gatt says, we just scheduled Steven Pinker, and I sprinted out of bed to grab the coupon spot. So you literally got me out of bed when I knew that I should have.
This is exactly the effect that Jenna and I were trying to go for. So we're very happy. Yep. Thank you so much.
Please time it for like 7 a.m. Eastern. It's just the ideal time to announce really good guests for II Salon.
I was on holiday and I was like, I'm not going to work now for 10 days. And then 5 minutes later, Gena messaged me. I was like, maybe I will work, you know? Yeah, there's like a force majeure to override it. Guys, let's close the meeting. Thank you so much for coming. This was wonderful. And Gena, you're a heroine, and everybody, amazing questions. I think Steven stayed longer than he planned to, which is a great sign that he had a great time. I can't wait to continue the conversation on Discord and on Twitter. And see you very soon again, I hope.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Take care.
Thank you. Bye.